The plane lurched hard left, metal creaking as cabin lights flickered. Overhead bins snapped open. A tray of cutlery clattered to the aisle. Passengers screamed. Somewhere near row 2D, a woman gripped her oxygen mask like a lifeline. Eyes locked on the man slumped beside her, unconscious, face pale, lips tinged blue. Jason Statham didn't panic. He stood, one hand braced against the overhead, the other pulling off his hoodie in a single motion. His eyes scanned the aisle, calculating, silent, and then he moved toward the man on the floor. Flight attendants staggered, untrained hands fumbling for emergency protocol. But Jason had already dropped to his knees, fingers pressed to the carotid, assessing damage the others couldn't see. But this wasn't where it began. This wasn't about turbulence or heart failure or sudden heroism. This began 3 hours earlier, long before the clouds turned black and the sky lost its calm. It began with a seat, and a man who thought Jason didn't belong in it. The flight boarded slow, London to Dubai. 16 hours of stale air, forced smiles and corporate flyers wearing noise-canceling armor. Jason walked on last, not because he was late but because he preferred to move when others had already picked their territories. He wore an old gray hoodie, track pants and black trainers, the kind of outfit that said he didn't care what people thought because he didn't. He moved through first class without looking around, ticket tucked between his fingers, backpack slung loose over one shoulder. He reached seat 1A and paused. The man already in 1B looked up, polished loafers, navy blazer, expensive haircut, mid-40s, loud aura. He gave Jason a once-over that dripped judgment, then he chuckled under his breath. Jason slid into his window seat, quiet. He placed his bag under the seat in a single motion. No fumble, no wasted effort. A stewardess passed, nodded. Jason nodded back. That should have been the end of it, but the man beside him leaned sideways, voice low, just sharp enough to cut. He said it was cute how some people saved all year for one flight in first class. Said Jason must have gotten lucky with a last-minute upgrade. Said something about lottery winners and gym bros. Jason didn't answer. He pulled out a paperback, the spine cracked, corners curled. It was a war memoir. Not one he'd written. One he'd lived through, though the author hadn't known. The man scoffed again. Called it wannabe tough guy reading. Jason flipped a page. That silence, that refusal to engage made the man worse. He flagged the stewardess. Complained loudly about seat privacy. Asked if there were any more appropriate rows for passengers like him. She apologized, politely. Told him the cabin was full. He sighed loudly. Pulled out his laptop. Started typing like the keyboard owed him money. Jason kept reading. Outside the window, the sky darkened. Takeoff was smooth. Meals were served. The plane climbed to 35,000 feet. Somewhere over the Adriatic, most passengers began to drift into that half-sleep unique to long-haul flights, headphones on, mouths slack, eyes half shut, but not Jason, and not the man beside him. He kept sipping whiskey, loudly recounting financial wins on speakerphone to someone named Greg. He laughed too hard, threw shade at everyone who passed by, called a steward kid. At one point he leaned toward Jason and asked what gym he trained at. Jason said he didn't. The man smiled like he'd caught him in a lie, said, "Yeah, but you look like you train a lot. You some kind of personal trainer?" Jason looked at him once and said quietly, "No," then returned to his book. The man kept pressing. He asked what Jason did, where he lived. How someone like you ends up in 1A. Jason never looked up again. That's when the man got loud. He stood, wobbling slightly from too many bottles too many, and made a joke about wannabe action heroes and bodyguards flying above their pay grade. He said he felt unsafe next to someone with that look. Said it loud enough for the rows behind them to hear. A few chuckled. Nervously, one flight attendant approached, tried to calm things down. Jason remained still, said nothing. The man eventually sat again. Spoke into his phone about how people have no place in cabins they don't understand. Bragged about owning real estate in 7 countries. Called his ex-wife dead weight. Jason closed his book. Eyes never left the page, but the flight attendant from earlier caught his look, just once. And something in her expression changed. She stopped offering the man refills after that. 2 hours passed. Then the turbulence hit. At first it was mild, just a slight drop that made drinks sway. But the fastened seatbelt light flicked on and people began stirring. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but quick. Then the second jolt came, hard, sharp. The plane dipped for a second long enough to trigger gasps. Overhead bins creaked. One snapped open, dropping a duffel near the galley. And in the middle of it all, the man in 1B clutched his chest, hard. At first, Jason thought he was reaching for the seatbelt. But then came the noise, a strained cough, a choked inhale. His face turned pale. The veins in his neck bulged. His pupils widened. The man tried to speak, but only foam touched his lips. Then he collapsed, half on Jason, half in the aisle. Chaos broke loose. 2 flight attendants screamed. One reached for the phone, the other reached for an oxygen tank she didn't know how to use. Jason was already on the floor. He rolled the man onto his back, checked his pulse, listened to the breathing. He looked at the lips, blue, eyes glassy, a blockage. Maybe more. Jason snapped his fingers fast, loud. The nearest stewardess flinched. He told her to get the med kit, told her the code for the defib. She didn't ask who he was, she just ran. Jason tilted the man's head back, checked the airway, pulled a small knife from his own sock, quietly, calmly, used it to adjust the angle of the tongue and cleared a blockage from the throat. Then came compressions, fast, measured. He didn't count aloud, he didn't shout. He moved like someone who had done this before, not once but in rain, mud, under fire. By the time the AED arrived, he had already resuscitated the rhythm. The man gasped, air rushed back in. His eyes fluttered. He was alive. Jason sat back. Quietly, didn't celebrate, just adjusted his sleeves. The passengers behind him had fallen silent. Someone whispered his name, not sir. Not hey you, his real name, Jason Statham. And suddenly, that seat in 1A didn't seem so random. The cabin hadn't fully exhaled yet. The oxygen mask still dangled like ghost arms from the ceiling, some swaying with the motion of the aircraft. Trays and cups still lay scattered across the floor. Uneaten meals dripping sauce down aisle rugs that had seen less dramatic stains. The air was thick, not just with recycled pressure or fear, but with the weight of something unspoken. They had just witnessed something they didn't understand. Jason Statham knelt beside the man he had just pulled back from the edge. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't proud. He was doing what needed to be done. And now, quietly, he was making sure the man didn't relapse. His fingers checked pulse points behind the ear, beneath the jaw. Subtle, efficient, constant. The man's breathing had normalized. His eyes were still fluttering, barely conscious, but the worst had passed. The lead flight attendant finally arrived, flanked by 2 more. Her eyes locked on Jason first, then the man on the floor. She had the portable med kit cradled against her chest like a life raft. She offered it, trembling slightly. Jason waved it off, already done. The co-pilot's voice came on overhead, shaky but composed. Medical emergency acknowledged. Diversion possible. Stand by for reroute. But Jason stood and shook his head. He spoke in a low tone, just enough for the staff around him to hear. The man could survive the flight. Pressure was stable. Heart rhythm was good. No need to land. That decision, that calm assertion of knowledge froze the room, because now they weren't just wondering who Jason was. They were realizing how wrong they'd been about him. A passenger across the aisle leaned forward. An older man in a suit, balding, glasses slightly crooked from turbulence. He whispered it, not loud, but just audible enough for others to catch the breath behind it. That's Jason Statham, isn't it? The name rolled through the cabin like lightning behind a storm cloud. Suddenly, people were sitting straighter, whispering more boldly. Someone pulled a phone from a pocket and began scrolling. A woman near the front muttered something about that movie with the oil rig and the pirates. Another said he used to be SAS, right? But Jason wasn't listening. He had moved to the galley, rinsing his hands in a tiny sink, blood from his knuckles swirling in the faucet. Not his blood, the man's. A cracked lip from the fall. The flight attendant from earlier approached again. The one who'd seen Jason's look long before the rest of the plane caught up. She asked quietly if he wanted to file a formal report about the harassment earlier, the insults, the complaint lodged against him. Jason just looked at her and said it didn't matter. Because men like that didn't need to be punished. They needed to live long enough to understand what they almost lost. She nodded. Didn't press further. Jason returned to his seat. The man was now reclined in 1B, an oxygen mask fitted over his mouth, heartbeat monitored by a patch sensor Jason had applied himself. His eyes were open now, bleary. Confused, Jason didn't look at him, but the man looked at Jason. And for the first time since they boarded, he didn't have anything to say. He knew. Jason closed his eyes and leaned back. He wasn't tired. He was patient, the plane settled, cruising altitude returned, and for nearly an hour silence ruled the cabin, but something had changed. Every time Jason moved to adjust his seatbelt, to sip water, to glance out the window, people watched, not intrusively, but with awe, reverence, not because he was a celebrity, but because they'd seen what legacy looked like in motion. The rude man eventually turned to Jason. It took him 3 tries to say the words. The first came out wrong, mumbled, weak. The second was almost sarcastic, like his ego wanted one last punch. But the third time it was real. He apologized. Jason didn't answer, not because he was cruel, but because sometimes silence is heavier than any sentence, and the man understood that. The rest of the flight passed without noise, at least until hour 9, when a steward from business class passed Jason a note, folded. No name, inside, just 2 words scribbled in tense handwriting. "They're watching." Jason's eyes narrowed. He stood up slowly, stretched, glanced back down the aisle. Nothing obvious, no sudden movement, but one of the passengers in row 3C wasn't blinking enough. He was sitting like he didn't need to, back ramrod straight, not slouching like anyone else. Halfway through a transatlantic haul, Jason made his way to the lavatory, passed the seat, didn't stop, but his mind was already locked. That wasn't a tourist, it wasn't a businessman either. It was a tale. Jason had been followed before, usually by amateurs, but this was different. He didn't know who had flagged him, but someone had. It wasn't about the heart attack anymore. It wasn't even about the insult. This flight was now a node in something bigger, something planned. Jason returned to his seat and adjusted his tray. Inside his backpack, zipped deep into a side pocket, was a flash drive wrapped in an old sock. Nothing about it looked valuable, but it was the reason he'd booked this flight in the first place. It wasn't about comfort, it was about route. This specific path, London to Dubai, ran a data corridor overhead, one used by a particular satellite Jason needed to intercept at a precise timestamp. That drive carried embedded intel meant to be pinged once, just once, across a relay 38,000 feet over the Indian Ocean. But if someone was on board who knew that, they weren't here to film him or ask for an autograph. They were here to stop the upload. Jason reached beneath his seat, felt the weight of the pack, and confirmed it hadn't been tampered with. Then he breathed once, shallow, silent, and counted seconds until the next drink service. Because he wasn't going to wait. The man in 3C had already started to move. Jason stood, one smooth motion, and started walking back, not to the bathroom but toward the galley behind business class. The final reveal hadn't happened yet, but it was coming. And when it did, the rude man in 1B, who thought this was just a flight, would realize he'd been sitting beside the only reason anyone aboard was still alive, and that survival had a cost. The galley was narrow and dim, lined with metal cabinets and cluttered carts that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and reheated eggs. Jason Statham stood just inside the curtain that separated business class from the rear of first. He kept his back to the bulkhead and his eyes on the reflection in the metal surface of the overhead compartment. The man in 3C hadn't moved much, but Jason could feel the shift. His posture had stiffened. His neck craned just a little further to track Jason's location. Too aware, too practiced. Jason tilted his head, not far, just enough to see the steward moving down the aisle with a drink cart. The timing was almost perfect, almost. He adjusted the strap on his backpack and stepped out into the aisle. The movement was silent, precise. One stride placed him just behind the cart. The steward, a younger guy with wide eyes and jittery hands, started to say something, but Jason placed a calm hand on his shoulder, told him to take a break. The man froze, but something in Jason's tone made him obey. He nodded, shuffled off toward the front galley without a word. Jason pushed the cart himself now, gliding it slowly down the aisle. Every rattle of its wheels masked the sound of his own movement. Passengers looked up but saw nothing unusual, just a man doing a flight attendant's job, until he stopped at row 3C. The man looked up, smile already forming, too friendly, too quick. He asked for water. Jason leaned closer, pulled a small bottle from the cart and passed it. Then he spoke, soft, direct. He said, "You're sitting wrong." The man blinked, confused for a beat too long. Jason continued. Said no one naturally tucks their left foot beneath their right unless they're hiding a pressure sheath. Said he'd been watching him skip every meal but still unfold napkins to pretend he'd eaten. Said the twitch in his right eye wasn't fatigue, it was focus strain. Retinal tracker. Probably cheap, civilian grade, but enhanced enough for long-range facial logging. The smile vanished. The man shifted just slightly, enough for Jason to see the shape beneath his jacket. Not a gun, too tight to the body. A signal booster, shoulder-mounted, disguised as a brace. Jason straightened, said one more thing. He told him the flight was his now. The man didn't respond. But Jason could already see the flex in his wrist, a hand signal, low, toward the aisle behind him. Jason moved before the second operative could even rise from seat 5D. The cart rolled backwards, slamming into the aisle wall. Jason stepped into the space between seats, grabbed the second man by the lapel and yanked him upward. The attacker moved fast, hand to waist, but Jason's elbow caught him in the throat before he could finish the draw. The man crumpled back into the seat, gasping. Passengers screamed, flight attendants froze. Jason stood calmly between rows 3 and 5, one arm raised like a referee, the other holding a small silver badge, old, scratched, but recognizable to anyone who'd spent time around real intelligence operators. He told the crew that the two men were unauthorized agents. He told them to lock the cockpit and for someone to bring the flight manifest. Now, the woman from earlier, the only one who hadn't flinched during the heart attack, moved fast. She didn't question. She just ran. The rude man in 1B leaned into the aisle to see what was happening. His face had turned ashen again, not from physical weakness but from something deeper. The dawning realization that the man he had insulted was handling a situation that no one else even understood. Jason returned to 3C, told him to open the SATCOM implant. The man laughed. Low. Called him outdated. So Jason reached under the cart, opened a hidden zipper pocket and pulled a jamming disc the size of a coaster. He slapped it onto the floor, tapped the side twice and watched the LED go red, signal dead. Now the man stopped smiling. Jason reached into his own backpack and pulled the flash drive, held it in front of the man's face. He said this was what they wanted, said they weren't here to assassinate, they were here to intercept. Jason explained that this drive carried a satellite bypass key, one that allowed recon access to a secure corridor above the Indian Ocean, not to steal information, but to confirm a location, one that had gone dark 2 years ago. The location, a forward SEAL outpost buried under false coordinates. Written off, abandoned, but not empty. Jason had intel that operators were still alive there, forgotten. And if he didn't upload the ping within the next 2 hours, the window would close, forever. The man in 3C said none of that mattered. Said the contract had come from higher than Jason could imagine. Said letting the ping go through would trigger consequences that even legacy agents couldn't walk away from. Jason leaned in, asked one question. Who signed the contract? The man didn't answer. So Jason pressed the disc against the man's temple. Just once, not hard, just enough to make him remember what pain felt like. Then he walked back up the aisle. The cabin had fallen into that strange, haunted silence, the kind that settles in after seeing something violent, clean, and necessary. Jason reached the galley, pulled open the flight communications panel and plugged in the flash drive. The system tried to resist, old protocol firewalls, but Jason had burned through worse. 30 seconds passed. The signal found its path. Above the clouds, 28,000 feet higher, a satellite shimmered in space, dormant until now. Then it blinked, and the ping went through. Jason watched the screen flicker green. Confirmed. Data logged. Mission complete. He leaned back against the panel, eyes closed, breathing even. The man in 1B stared at him from across the cabin, not in fear, in something else, respect, or something close to it. He stood, slowly, shuffled forward, asked if Jason needed help. Jason looked at him once, measured, then shook his head. No, the help wasn't needed. The lesson had already landed. The aircraft dipped slowly beneath the clouds, its belly gliding through cotton layers of morning gold. Sunlight cut through the windows in fractured slats, catching dust motes and exhausted eyes. Dubai shimmered in the distance, a horizon of glass and ambition. Inside the cabin, no one slept. Not anymore. First class was silent in a way no one expected. No chatter, no calls, no drink requests. Every passenger sat with the shared weight of having witnessed something that no boarding pass had prepared them for. A man who was mocked, ignored, nearly removed from the plane, had not only saved a life, but neutralized a threat they didn't even know existed. Jason Statham hadn't spoken in almost an hour. He sat quietly in seat 1A, arms crossed, hoodie draped over one shoulder. The flash drive was gone, mission complete. His eyes weren't closed, but they weren't focused either. He wasn't relaxing. He was listening. Every wheel rotation, every whisper between the crew, it all registered. The man in 1B hadn't moved much. He was still recovering from the cardiac episode, though the oxygen mask had been removed. He looked at Jason now the way a child looks at fire, with awe, fear, and an urge to reach out but knowing better. Eventually, he leaned toward Jason, cleared his throat, spoke softly, called him Mr. Statham. Jason didn't look over. The man said he'd been wrong, said he'd misjudged, said he didn't know who Jason was, but now he did. Jason finally turned his head, said nothing, just stared. And in that moment the man stopped talking. Because sometimes silence is a heavier answer than forgiveness, and Jason wasn't there to forgive. He wasn't even there to be right. He was there to finish something. Seatbelt signs chimed on. The cabin prepared for descent. The co-pilot announced local time and weather. No one cared. They were all still somewhere between disbelief and recalibration. The flight crew made final rounds. One steward, the young one who'd watched Jason disable the tail, walked past, then paused. He handed Jason a folded napkin, said there was no note, just a thank you from someone in row 6. Jason unfolded it. Inside, a doodle of a torch, below it 3 numbers, a private channel, seal side. Jason folded it back up and tucked it into his sock without a word. He hadn't worn that patch in 10 years, but someone on this flight remembered. Landing gear dropped with a hollow thud. Dubai loomed large now, the kind of city where secrets dressed like executives and every skyscraper had a story beneath it. The plane touched down smooth, too smooth, like the pilot was afraid to break the mood. When the wheels rolled to a halt, seatbelts clicked open, but no one stood. They waited for Jason to move first. He didn't rush. He reached beneath his seat, pulled out the worn backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and stood. A few people nodded. Some cleared their throats like they wanted to say something, ask something. Nobody did, until the man from 1B reached out. Offered a handshake. Jason looked at it, then at him, and without a word he kept walking. Not rude, not cold, just done. In the jet bridge, the heat hit instantly, humid, sticky, the kind that clung to skin and made you forget the cold at 35,000 feet. Jason walked steadily, steps controlled, like nothing about the last 16 hours had fazed him. He was almost at the terminal exit when he saw the man waiting. Tan jacket, aviator shades, pressed shirt, Tom Cruise. Leaning against a support column with a duffel at his feet and a smirk he couldn't quite hide, Jason stopped. Tom tilted his head, pushed off the column, said something about being late. Jason said something about never landing early. They walked together. No hugs, no grand reunion. Just 2 ghosts moving through the crowd. Tom mentioned the ping went through. Said command had already pulled the signal. No one expected survivors from that outpost. But 5 had replied. Jason just nodded. That was enough. Tom asked if he wanted a lift. Jason shook his head. He had his own ride. Tom said of course he did. They stopped near the exit. Tom asked what happened on the plane. Jason didn't answer, just looked back once over his shoulder toward the gate they'd come from. Tom followed his gaze, asked if someone needed to be followed up on. Jason said no. That wasn't his style anymore. Then he said one more thing, he said. Sometimes people don't need punishment, just a front row seat. Tom didn't ask what that meant. He just smiled. Jason walked off. No security, no handlers, no press. Just a man in a hoodie, walking into the brightest city in the world like it wasn't even looking at him. Back on the plane, the rude man sat in his seat, still staring at the aisle Jason had walked down. The silence lingered. Not because he had anything left to say, but because, deep down, he knew he wouldn't forget this. Not today. Not ever. And maybe, just maybe, the next time he sat beside someone like Jason, he'd ask a different question first.